So with Eternals dropping into theaters, I thought it was past time that we ranked the MCU soundtracks. So without further ado, here are the top 30 MCU soundtracks ranked from worst to best. So before we get into it, please know that this is just my personal ranking. It's not the right one. With that being said, I do love to hear your guys' ranking down in the comments below, so be sure to let me know, and let's get into it. Coming in at last place, it is unfortunately Iron Man 2. Now, I do not by any means dislike this soundtrack, but I feel like out of all that the MCU has produced in terms of music, this is definitely the most forgettable one. Mainly because if you would ask me right now, like I've seen Iron Man 2 about 4 or 5 times now, if you would ask me to name a single track from that soundtrack, I wouldn't know. That being said, John Debney did do a great job, and he of course had AC/DC to back his corner. But I just feel like it doesn't outshine the movie. I mean, there's a few moments in the movie where it definitely adds effect to it, but with all that being said, it is for me the most forgettable soundtrack in the entire MCU. Coming in at number 29, it is Spider-Man Far From Home. Now, again, I do not dislike this soundtrack. I think Michael Giacchino did a great job, as they did on Spider-Man Homecoming, but I feel like a lot of the soundtrack from Far From Home is rehashed from Spider-Man Homecoming. What also plays a big part in me not loving that soundtrack is that I didn't love the movie, and I felt the soundtrack really only amplified the scene where there was an action sequence. Like on the bridge, the swinging set, you know, the Spider-Man Far From Home swinging set, you know, that's one of the biggest soundtracks on that album. And I feel like it only really amplifies the story when there's action, which, you know, is good. There's nothing wrong with that. But I feel like a soundtrack has to also amplify the more emotional moments and the more character-based moments, which maybe this movie also didn't have a lot of. It was mostly action and some cringy comedy and some teenage drama. But mainly, the soundtrack really should be something different, and that's why I'm kind of frustrated with what they did with Far From Home. But, you know, at the end, it's still a solid entry into the MCU. At number 28, we have Captain Marvel. Another one of those really controversial Marvel movies. Some people really loved it, some people really didn't like it. And then there's the soundtrack. Now, the soundtrack has a great theme. The Captain Marvel theme is great. It is probably one of the better actual character themes since we've had the Captain America theme. However, the rest of the soundtrack is incredibly forgettable. There is, outside of that track, there is not really anything that I would listen to on a weekly basis, because, you know, I love soundtracks. I listen to soundtracks daily. I love it. But on that album, the only soundtrack I would listen to on a regular basis would be the Captain Marvel theme. The rest of it, it's just forgettable. It works with the movie to a certain extent, but I just feel there's a lot missing in the soundtrack. When you look at the scenes that actually really matter, like when Carol actually finds out who she is, she remembers, you know, she's reunited with her friend Maria and with Monica, and, you know, that should have like this emotional effect that, you know, gets brought up. And the movie lacked a lot of that, but so did the soundtrack. In number 27, we have The Incredible Hulk. Now, The Incredible Hulk will always be known as the black sheep of the MCU. People often don't even include it in the MCU, which is, you know, fair. I'm very happy that they finally decided to include Abomination back into the MCU, which also makes it worthwhile watching The Incredible Hulk to get to know the character, especially when you know that they're going to build off of that a little more now. In terms of the soundtrack, Craig Armstrong did a good job. There's nothing wrong with the soundtrack. It's just not very memorable. But once again, that has to tie in with the actual movie itself. The movie is not really exciting. There's a few exciting scenes. There's a few emotional scenes, which is also the reason why I've placed The Incredible Hulk above the ones who came before this. Because I feel like not only does this soundtrack amplify the story when it's a fight scene, but this one also really puts the emphasis on more emotional scenes and really puts them up a notch, which is why I've placed this one above the others. In number 26, we have a newer entry into the MCU with Black Widow, a fairly average MCU film in my opinion. I think we should have gotten it back in 2016 right after Civil War, as do a lot of people, because it just takes you out of the movie because you know what Natasha's fate is. With that being said, I do love the movie. I think it is a great addition to the MCU, and so is the soundtrack. I think that Firefly's theme really is the cherry on top of this soundtrack. Yelena's theme also very, very good, and I think that Natasha's Lullaby is also a very, very nice little addition to the soundtrack. Lauren Balfe did a great job with this soundtrack, and I must say I didn't expect it to be as good as I did. When I first listened to the soundtrack, I felt like, oh, this is Black Widow. This is Black Widow. He got the momentum of the character so well, and I think because the movie has some very emotional moments with her and Yelena, it really caught that little glimpse of the bond that they have, and that really hits you in the feels with this soundtrack. Coming in at number 25, it is Iron Man, composed by the great Ramin Djawadi, one of our favorite composers because he did Game of Thrones. A lot of people actually don't know that Ramin Djawadi did Iron Man 1. It's also because Iron Man's soundtrack is not on Spotify, which is very unfortunate. I think it is only the only MCU edition that isn't on Spotify. With that being said, he did do a great job, and when I was making this ranking, I was like, wow, Iron Man at number 25? And that just gives you an idea how incredible the soundtracks have been in the MCU. I feel like Iron Man is a great soundtrack. It's great. It just doesn't have the emotional effect that other movies have. It doesn't have the memorable sounds, the memorable themes that all the other MCU movies do have. This one, unfortunately, doesn't really have that, even though it is the first addition into the MCU. And he delivered a great soundtrack, and it's very memorable, it's very Iron Man. But what also really drops the Iron Man 1 soundtrack down on this list is the Iron Man 3 soundtrack. Now, I am a great fan of the Iron Man 3 soundtrack, but it was completely different, because the difference between Iron Man 1 and 2, they went away from the AC/DC, and they went to Brian Tyler to do Iron Man 3. Which was completely different. Like, when you listen to the Iron Man 1 and 2 soundtrack, and then you listen to the Iron Man 3 soundtrack, it sounds like it's a completely different character. But I have more love for the Iron Man 3 soundtrack than I have for the Iron Man 1 and 2 soundtrack, which is why they're lower on this list. Coming in at number 24, it is What If, the animated show that got everyone hyped and excited for the MCU again. Now, the MCU really did a great job pulling into the fact of the what if question. I think it's a very good concept, and they executed it perfectly. Laura Cartman, who is someone I didn't know before I listened to the soundtrack. I saw that was the woman who did the soundtrack. I had no idea who she was. I don't know any other movies or things that she has done. But for a first theme of soundtrack and this animated show, I think she did an incredible job, especially in the episodes that were harder to score. Like I feel like it's easier to score an episode with a lot of action because you get upbeat tracks, but when you go to the more emotional scenes, as I've talked about before, you need to really find the right note that will hit the viewers. And I think especially in that Doctor Strange episode, what if Doctor Strange lost his heart instead of his hands? I really think that in that episode, it's the soundtrack at its absolute best. And even though that there are a few other incredible tracks in there, I mean, for Chadwick, and those are really awesome tracks that they did that. But in general, I fell in love with the soundtrack with the Doctor Strange episode the most. Next on the list is WandaVision, an amazing show that always puts a smile on my face when I watch it, especially the first time. And the soundtrack is also very good. I think the only downside I have to the soundtrack is that just like the TV show itself, it starts off relatively slow. There's nothing really memorable in the show in the first 2 episodes, and neither is there in the soundtrack, which is why it doesn't go higher on the list. But I feel like this WandaVision show is a perfect example of when the show and the soundtrack are perfectly balanced.
This whole thing should be.
They are together, one doesn't carry the other, which is very important in some soundtracks. In other cases, sometimes the soundtrack really carries the scene or the movie, and in other instances, the movie really carries the soundtrack and it doesn't add anything to it. But in this instance, it's a perfectly balanced show. Next on the list, it is Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which has one of my favorite characters in the entire MCU, Bucky Barnes, and with a soundtrack that is very, very good. Henry Jackman came back to do it after doing Captain America the Winter Soldier, which is one of the best ideas that they've had, because that's why the characters feel incredibly familiar, and that's why the themes playing in the background aren't completely new. They're taken from Captain America the Winter Soldier, and they add a little new flavor, which is very, very nice. I think Louisiana Hero is probably one of my favorite additions to this soundtrack, but it also has a lot of emotional weight to it. I think You're Free is one of the best examples of that. You know, we have Bucky Barnes sitting there, and the IO says the words to him, and he finally realizes that he's free. He can no longer be controlled by the mind control, and that soundtrack really, really hits you in the feels when you care about that character. Coming in at number 21, it is the smallest adventure in the entire MCU with Ant-Man. Christoph Beck did an incredible, incredible job on this soundtrack. It's probably a movie that you wouldn't expect to have such a great soundtrack because it's a fairly average movie. But boy, the soundtrack does so well to amplify the movie scenes. I absolutely love Ant-Man. I think that the Ant-Man theme is incredible and it fits so well. It's like a tippy-toe little track that they put in there, and it is just Ant-Man for me. It works so well, and it's just, honestly, when I hear the Ant-Man theme, it just immediately puts a smile on my face. I think it's so well picked, and it describes and screams Ant-Man. Coming in at number 20, it is Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, composed by Joel P. West, who of course also did The Glass Castle. If you haven't seen this movie, I would recommend watching it. It's incredible, as well as the soundtrack. I think Zhu Shang-Chi is a really standout track for me. It really puts the emphasis on the character. I love the character. It's his theme. It works really well with him. It's, you know, a theme that is very recurring into the movie. I love when you hear the theme for the first time, and then you kind of hope secretly that you're going to see it further on into the movie, and then it's more incredible, and it's a nice little callback, which is exactly what Zhu Shang-Chi does. And I feel like this was a very, very nice addition into the MCU, both in terms of the soundtrack and the movie. Coming in at number 19, it is The Eternals, one of the newest entries into the MCU, and of course composed by the brilliant Ramin Djawadi, who I absolutely love. I was a big Game of Thrones fan, and after seeing him carry that season 8, it's safe to say I was so incredibly excited when I heard that he was going to be the one to compose this movie. Now, when I heard this soundtrack for the first time, I was absolutely not disappointed. I mean, his track perfectly embodies what the movie is trying to be. I think the Eternals theme is a real standout. It's absolutely incredible. I always love the character themes in a movie, and this is an absolute team theme. I mean, it's not as big as the Avengers theme, but the Eternals theme is up there for me, and I really think that they really hit the nail in the coffin for this lovely soundtrack. Number 18, Captain America Civil War, one of probably the better MCU movies to date, but it's somewhere in the middle of the list. You're probably wondering why. I don't know. I think out of all the other MCU movies that we still have to go over, I think this is the weakest soundtrack. There are not really many soundtracks in there that I would say are a real standout. I mean, I love character themes, so I love Zemo's theme. It's incredible. Of course, the airport scene is incredible and has a great soundtrack. And of course, Cap's Promise is absolutely amazing. But it sticks to those two soundtracks, and I just feel like that the other movies that are still to come on the list have more memorable and a few better soundtracks in there. So that's why it's a bit lower. Next on the list, it is Avengers Age of Ultron, one of the more disappointing MCU movies for me personally. And mainly that is because I'm a big comic book Ultron fan, and I really didn't think that they did the character a lot of justice. That being said, I do think Ultron is a decent villain. I mean, James Spader did an incredible job voicing him, but it's just not the Ultron that I knew. And with the soundtrack, also, as I've said in a lot of other ones that have come lower on the list, there aren't any memorable soundtracks in there. There are a few, but those are literally based on the soundtracks that were already in the original Avengers movie, and they've just put a new set of paint on there and put it out back again. The Avengers theme is incredible. That's why it is also, you know, it's higher up the list. The Avengers theme, they did an incredible job with that. And then Danny Elfman came in and did one track for the movie, which is also one of the better ones. Not taking nothing away from Brian Tyler. I think Brian Tyler is a great composer. But I think that they should have stuck to Alan Silvestri for all 4 Avengers movies. It really feels like the odd one out. I mean, the original Avengers, Infinity War, and Endgame were all 3 composed by Alan Silvestri. And that's why Age of Ultron kind of feels like the odd one out. It's not a bad soundtrack. It's just not the same. Coming in at number 16, it is Thor Ragnarok, composed by the amazing Mark Mothersbaugh, who I had never heard of before Thor Ragnarok. But when I first saw the movie, I was immediately impressed with this soundtrack. I felt like the inclusion of Led Zeppelin's Immigrant Song was very, very good. And I think it kind of rubs off on the soundtrack. I mean, it really had this 70s to 80s type vibe to it, even though it was completely set in Asgard, like a different planet, and it all looked very futuristic with all the colors. And I think that the soundtrack fits the movie really, really well. I think maybe even out of all the MCU movies, I feel like this is the most unique soundtrack. Not in terms of like it's unique to the movie, but it's unique in terms of I've never really listened to a soundtrack quite like it. It is relatively similar to something like Guardians of the Galaxy, but yet it feels really, really different, which I thought was a nice inclusion because, you know, everyone loved Guardians of the Galaxy and everyone loved the soundtrack, and if you didn't love the actual themes, you loved the music that's put into it. And I think with Thor Ragnarok, Taika Waititi took a turn for the best, especially for the Thor franchise, and it came out as an incredible, incredible soundtrack and movie. Now we have finally made it halfway down the list with number 15, Doctor Strange, one of the more underrated movies in the MCU, and also one of the more underrated soundtracks in the MCU. I think Michael Giacchino did a great, great job capturing the mythical element that the movie clearly brings to the table. I think it's a original soundtrack. I really think that it is something that we haven't heard before, and I think that with tracks like Going for Baroque and The Master of the Mystic Arts, that they really stand out. Those are the 2 standout tracks for me, and I really, really love it. But it also puts an amazing emphasis on the emotional moments. Like one of the more famous moments in Doctor Strange is the conversation between the Ancient One and Doctor Strange when they're staring out the window. And I think that the track that plays right under that scene is absolutely incredible, and it only amplifies the scene more and more, which really gave me the push to put this higher up on the list, and that's why it's at number 15. Coming in at number 14, it is Ant-Man and the Wasp. Christoph Beck returning to do the sequel, and he does outdo himself by a long shot. Ant-Man's soundtrack was good. Ant-Man and the Wasp soundtrack, incredible. It Ain't Over Till the Wasp Lady Sings, incredible addition to the actual soundtrack, and whoever's idea it was to add Baba Yaga's Lullaby to the actual soundtrack album is a genius. I love that they actually added that into the soundtrack. I actually own the soundtrack on vinyl, and I'm, to this day, extremely happy I picked it up when I did. And especially because Ant-Man and the Wasp is a criminally underrated soundtrack, and for me, one of the most surprising additions to the MCU. Number 13, Spider-Man Homecoming. The return of Michael Giacchino, of course, he did Doctor Strange, and now he's doing Spider-Man Homecoming, where I think he really failed at Spider-Man Far From Home. He did an amazing job with Homecoming, and just the opening sequence of the movie, seeing the Marvel logo and the original Spider-Man theme is just nostalgia. For all fans, I think it's so incredible that they did that, which is why I was also incredibly disappointed that they didn't do that in the second one. That little theme was such a nice addition, and it should have been put at least once into the sequel. And I hope it's coming back for No Way Home. I really think that that was such a nice surprise. And the Homecoming suite really works so well with the character, and it puts all of the scenes in place. It's a goofy soundtrack. It's kind of like Peter Parker, and it fits the character so incredibly well that's why it's so high on this list and so much higher than Spider-Man Far From Home. At number 12, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, a movie that I have to say I don't really like. There's a few scenes in there that I do like, but most mostly I am not a fan of this movie. I am not a fan of the movie. And the soundtrack, not taking into account all the songs that it brought to the table, because I'm just talking about the actual themes of the movie, so Tyler Bates' theme. Tyler Bates is probably one of my favorite composers. I think he also did one of my favorite soundtracks of all time, which is Frank's Choice from The Punisher. And I think he brings a lot of the same elements from the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie, and he reworks them in a great way that it makes you feel like, yes, this is Guardians of the Galaxy, but it's new. It's new, but it's old. It's familiar, but it's new. And that's where Michael Giacchino's Spider-Man Far From Home track kind of failed. I feel like it was, at least for me, a rehash from the original Homecoming score, and it was just too much of the same, which is why I think Tyler Bates knocked it out of the park with his Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 soundtrack. Because, you know, what I think is also incredible is you have to take into account that he had to work around all of the incredible songs that they already put into the movie. For a soundtrack to come out as memorable is an incredible achievement. Coming in at number 11, we have Avengers Infinity War, one of my favorite MCU films to date, and one of the better soundtracks of the MCU. I think Alan Silvestri is one of the true goats of the MCU soundtrack genre, and I think that he did an incredible job with this movie. Now, we have yet to get all the other Avengers movies that Alan Silvestri scored, and out of them three, I think Infinity War is the weakest out of the three. By no means is it bad. It's incredible. It's very, very good. That's why it's so high on the list. But out of the three, I feel like Infinity War had the least amount of memorable tracks in there. And you can say, of course, you know, you got Forge, which is, you know, one of the biggest and most awesome MCU scenes that there is. But in the end, Forge is just a rework of the original Avengers theme and is just combined with the moment. That being said, Infinity War is, of course, a great track, and that's why it's still very high on this list. At number 10, one of my other favorite Marvel movies, it is Captain America: The Winter Soldier. Now, this soundtrack is truly, truly something special. That's why it just made the top 10. I feel that Henry Jackman did an amazing job with this soundtrack. And when I actually heard about how they created the Winter Soldier theme, that they actually used Sebastian Stan's scream and they reversed it and stretched it, and that's how they created that sound, is such an incredible detail and shows such incredible dedication to making a great soundtrack. The movie is incredible. As I've said, it's one of my favorite movies in the MCU. For a lot of people it is. It's highly regarded as one of the best, if not the best. And I think this soundtrack really puts so much, or it adds so much to the already amazing movie that it just comes out on top, and that's why it has a spot in my top 10. Now at number 9, we have a bit of a surprise. We have Loki, the great TV show that was released this year, and I was completely blown away by it. Natalie Holt, which was also for me a completely unknown composer, but she did such a great job on this soundtrack. I mean, the TVA is, for me, honestly one of the best soundtracks in the entire MCU. And I love the soundtrack because I loved the original Patrick Doyle Thor soundtrack. I think it really brought out the best in the character. And I think that Natalie really took a lot of inspiration for that, and she used it in the Loki soundtrack. And I felt instantly connected to the show, and that was so powerful, and I never really experienced that in the MCU before. So that's why it's this high on the list. And if you haven't listened to any of the themes from the Loki show, please listen to the TVA or the Loki Green theme. They're absolutely incredible. Coming in at number 8, it is the Avengers movie, composed by Alan Silvestri, who is probably, for me, the GOAT of MCU movies. He is so good, and he is absolutely been responsible for 3 of my favorite MCU soundtracks, including this one. I think this Avengers movie had so many iconic themes, like the Avengers theme. How iconic is that theme right now? I feel like the movie by itself was something that was never done before. It was the kickstart to the entire universe, that the Marvel universe. Everyone loved it. Something of this scale was never done before. So many crossovers between characters, and Marvel nailed that. And Alan Silvestri just adds a little extra flavor to how great this movie already is. And in doing so, in creating this soundtrack, he created so many iconic themes that I still listen to this day. In number 7, we have Avengers Endgame, one of the other absolute favorites of Alan Silvestri, and boy, he does such a great job in this movie. It was meant to be a closure to Phase 3, and it does. I mean, the real hero, I think we all cried in theaters. I mean, if we're being honest, we all shed a tear for Tony, and that soundtrack makes it so much worse. It hits you in the feels, and that's exactly what a soundtrack is meant to do in types of situations like that one. And just the portals, I mean, do I need to say more about the portal scene? I mean, the scene is incredible. The soundtrack only makes it more incredible, and it's just so much fan service squished into one movie, and Alan Silvestri just composing his absolute heart out, and that's why this track is so high on this list. At number 6, we have probably also a bit of surprise. We have Thor, one of the weaker MCU additions, but one of the better soundtracks in the MCU. As I've said before, I love Patrick Doyle's Thor. It's just such a nice addition to the character, where I loved the direction Taika Waititi took Thor. And the Mark Mothersbaugh theme was incredible. They took it to a completely different direction, but I always have a place in my heart for Patrick Doyle's Thor theme. It's just, it feels like nostalgia for me, and for me that still is Thor, and I wish they went back to those type of sounds for Thor, even though that the score they used for Thor Ragnarok fits the character maybe better, at least in the direction he's going now. But I will never forget Patrick Doyle's Thor. It's just incredible, and I can listen to that all day long, and that is why that is so high up for me. And as you probably realize, we still haven't had Thor the Dark World, who even has a bigger place in my heart. Kicking off our top 5, it is Guardians of the Galaxy. Need I say more? One of the more pleasant surprises in the entire MCU. Probably the prime example of Marvel taking a huge risk and it paying off 1,000-fold. Guardians of the Galaxy was a doorway into a new era of filmmaking, and it was an era of a lot of older music being used. I feel like it started a trend. There's a lot of movies right now doing the same thing, but Guardians of the Galaxy is just unforgettable. Like, the opening sequence of Come and Get Your Love is probably, for me, one of the more iconic opening scenes to any movie. And as I said with Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, to make an incredible soundtrack while being overwhelmed by the amount of songs that are coming in, that are famous and people love that song, to make a memorable soundtrack just like Tyler Bates did, just goes to show how good Tyler Bates actually is. I mean, he has brought so many iconic themes to that movie. I mean, the Groot Spores or the Groot Cocoon, those themes carry such emotional weight, and even through all of the songs you hear in that movie, those tracks are also ones that stick by you. Number 4, Iron Man 3. Now, Brian Tyler did such a great job with this movie. I had written off Iron Man. I loved Iron Man 1. Iron Man 2 was an absolute disaster for me. Iron Man 3, the movie isn't incredible. It's also a more weak addition to the MCU, but the soundtrack is just incredible. The Stark theme is probably one of my favorites in the entire MCU, and is probably one of my favorite character themes that the MCU has ever done. Unfortunately, Tony is dead, so we're going to have to find a new favorite character theme. But I was so blown away by how different his theme was. And I thought I was going to miss AC/DC because they said we're not going to do AC/DC anymore. And I was like, that's Iron Man. When you think about Iron Man, you think about AC/DC. It's supposed to be in those movies. But the direction they took, the direction with Brian Tyler, is incredible and nowhere near what I would have expected from Iron Man 3. And that's why I'm so happy that the MCU takes a lot of risks, even with soundtracks. In third place, we have a very controversial pick, Thor the Dark World. Now, Thor: The Dark World is arguably the worst MCU movie, but the soundtrack is one of the best. Now, if you have never listened to the Thor: The Dark World soundtrack, I highly recommend you doing it, because even if the movie is bad, this soundtrack absolutely carries this movie, which is why it is so high on the list. I feel like this Thor is nostalgia for me. As I said, like, Patrick Doyle's original Thor is incredible. Thor: The Dark World is absolutely incredible. The title theme is just a cherry on top of Thor. And honestly, if I'm being completely honest, the only reason why I would rewatch Thor: The Dark World is because I get to listen to the amazing score of the movie. In second place, the runner-up, it is Captain America: The First Avenger. Alan Silvestri's only entry as a Captain America movie, but it is peak MCU. It is absolutely incredible. That soundtrack is a soundtrack that I will never forget. It is incredible. It has so many nice aspects to it. I mean, the Star Spangled Man, like, it brings me back to the start of the MCU. Like, I have almost seen every single MCU movie in theaters. I think the only ones I didn't watch were Iron Man and The Incredible Hulk. Those are the only two movies I haven't seen in theaters. And when I hear the Captain America theme, or the Howling Commandos montage, or the Star Spangled Man, it just brings me back to the nostalgia I had when I was watching it in theaters back then. And that is also why I think Captain America has some of the best themes in the entire MCU. Then in first place, it is Black Panther. I think for a lot of people, this is the most memorable MCU soundtrack to date. I think Ludwig Göransson is an incredible composer. I think he did such a great job with Black Panther. It's also one of the only soundtrack albums I have every single track of on Spotify. I listen to that album on a weekly basis. I own the album on vinyl as well. And I think that every single track in that movie has the same vibe, but every track is so much different than the other. Of course, Wakanda is such a huge build up to the crescendo kind of thing, and having Baba Mal who does the voice, like, it gives you kind of like Lion King vibes, you know, African, is you're in Africa, but it works so well with the nuance of the MCU, and how Wakanda is like this technological wonder, and some way this soundtrack finds the perfect balance of being an MCU film, being in Africa, and being so incredibly refreshing. And that's why it is my #1 pick for my favorite MCU soundtrack. Now, if you enjoyed me rambling on about how amazing soundtracks are, and you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment down below on what your ranking would be of all the MCU soundtracks. Leave a like, and please subscribe to my channel for more awesome content coming your way very soon.